Welcome to the channel. In the quiet valleys nestled between majestic mountains and endless stretches of dense forests lay the village of Greendale, a serene haven where humans and wildlife once shared their lives in harmony. For generations, villagers tended to their fields, harvested timber sustainably, and respected the unspoken boundaries set by nature. This balance, fragile yet enduring, seemed eternal. But beneath the surface tranquility brewed an unseen paradox. The inevitable tension between the boundless ambition of humanity and the primal rights of wildlife. The first signs of imbalance emerged subtly. Settlers, attracted by Greendale's pristine landscapes and fertile grounds, began arriving in ever-increasing numbers, each new wave bringing aspirations of growth, wealth, and modernity. Land that once belonged to wild animals transformed swiftly into human settlements. Meadows vanished beneath sprawling homes. Concrete roads split ancient forests, and once abundant wildlife corridors turned into isolated islands. Slowly, quietly, the wildlife responded, driven by necessity into confrontations they never sought. It began with minor inconveniences: a fox sneaking into a chicken coop, raccoons tipping over garbage bins, deer nibbling gardens at twilight. Initially, villagers saw these encounters as mere annoyances, issues easily remedied by simple deterrence. But the pressures mounted. Displaced and hungry animals grew bolder, moving closer to human habitation. Fear gradually seeped into the hearts of the villagers, coloring every shadow, every rustle in the darkness. Tensions erupted openly when wolves, symbols of wilderness itself, began appearing frequently around farms, their chilling howls haunting the villagers' sleepless nights. Farmers who once tolerated wildlife became fiercely protective, urging decisive action against what they perceived as an escalating threat. Arguments arose, splitting neighbors, friends, and families into opposing sides, each convinced of their righteousness. At the center of this brewing storm stood Eleanor, a wildlife biologist who had dedicated her life to conserving Greendale's biodiversity. Understanding both the villagers' fears and the animals' desperation, Eleanor tirelessly mediated, educating the community on sustainable coexistence. Her voice, though powerful, often felt drowned amid the rising clamor of panic and anger. One harrowing evening, Eleanor received an urgent call. The Miller family's livestock had been attacked. Racing there, her heart broke at the sight of an injured calf and furious villagers holding torches, ready for vengeance. They spoke of tracking and killing the wolf responsible. Eleanor pleaded earnestly. Violence won't end this conflict, it will deepen it. These animals are suffering, pushed to their limits. The solution lies in understanding, not bloodshed. But her words fell on deaf ears. Driven by rage and fear, the villagers disappeared into the night, intent on their grim task. Eleanor's efforts intensified over the following weeks. She proposed fences, wildlife corridors, and education programs, advocating tirelessly for coexistence and non-lethal management strategies. However, suspicion and mistrust had taken root deeply, poisoning the once peaceful atmosphere. Friendships fractured, families divided, and a dark cloud of fear enveloped the village. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never thought a quiet neighborhood could hide so many secrets, especially at my age, 58, and yet here I am, reflecting on how easily the familiar can become strange once the shadows of doubt take hold. I used to believe my life was comfortably predictable, mornings spent sipping tea on the porch, admiring the gentle sway of the magnolia trees that lined our street. Afternoons dedicated to painting in the cozy sunroom, and evenings nestled beside my husband, Charles, discussing the trivial events of our day over a simple dinner. The monotony was, in its own way, a comfort. I never felt the need to question it until one rainy afternoon changed everything. It was an early autumn day, the leaves turning gold and crimson, the sky heavy with thunderclouds, when our neighbor, Jonathan, appeared at my door, drenched to the bone by the sudden downpour. He was a man in his early 60s, silver hair neatly combed back, a somber expression that always felt guarded, despite living next door for over 20 years. I barely knew him beyond polite waves and occasional small talk, which is why, when he knocked on my door, water pooling around his expensive loafers, I felt a jolt of surprise. "Amelia," he said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to talk." I hesitated a moment, unsettled by the anxious look in his eyes, then nodded and stepped aside to let him in. He stood there in the foyer, raindrops sliding off his coat, forming small puddles at his feet. In that moment, I expected an apology for the intrusion, perhaps a simple request for a towel, but his next words set my heart racing. "It's about your husband, Charles." My chest tightened, my mind lurching instantly to worst-case scenarios. "Is he hurt?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. Jonathan offered a small, sympathetic shake of his head. "No, Amelia, he isn't hurt. It's more complicated than that." I felt an uneasy swirl of relief and dread, unsure which emotion held greater sway over me. "What's going on?" He exhaled slowly, and the weariness in his expression made him look older than I'd remembered. "I've been wrestling with whether or not I should tell you this, but I believe you deserve to know." Something about his tone set every nerve on edge. "Tell me what?" I demanded softly. He gestured for us to move to the living room, where I'd left a half-finished painting by the window. The steady patter of rain on the glass accompanied us, the only sound beyond the quickened beat of my heart. I offered him a seat, and he sank onto the floral-patterned couch while I carefully settled in the armchair opposite, wrapping my sweater tighter around myself. "I've watched you and Charles for years," he began, staring at his clasped hands. "You two seemed so in sync, like a perfect partnership. But there's another side to him that I doubt you've ever seen, and I can't keep this to myself anymore." "Jonathan," I said, an edge to my voice. "You're scaring me." He bowed his head. "I'm sorry, I truly am. But Charles has been meeting someone regularly outside town. There's a small cottage off the old country road. He goes there every Thursday." I felt the world shift beneath me. Thursday, Charles always said he was golfing on Thursdays. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Charles is an honest man, a reliable man." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. "I've seen it, I've followed him. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off." Anger erupted inside me like a flash of lightning, clashing with the swirling confusion and hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. "You followed my husband?" He nodded, regret etched into the lines of his face. "I know how it sounds, but the moment I noticed inconsistencies, I felt compelled to find the truth. I know you've always been kind to everyone, always supportive. It felt wrong to let you live in ignorance." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them away. "What proof do you have?" He reached inside his coat, pulling out a phone. I tensed, unsure I even wanted to see what he had to show me. "I took these pictures, but I can delete them if you want," he murmured. Offering me the screen, I forced myself to look. There was Charles, plain as day, stepping out of his car near a small ivy-covered cottage with a woman who looked to be in her mid-50s, elegantly dressed, a warm smile directed at him. And one photo, they stood close, closer than friends might stand. And another, Charles opened the door of the cottage while she gently touched his shoulder, and my throat constricted painfully. Everything about my predictable life began to spin in my mind like a broken carousel, each memory blurred by the suspicion that I'd been living a lie. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. Jonathan set the phone down with a soft sigh. "I couldn't bear watching you remain oblivious any longer." He gave me a look so filled with compassion that it nearly broke me. "You deserve better." I wrapped my arms around my torso, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the house. "Charles is my whole life," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "We've built everything together." "Sometimes," Jonathan said gently, "we get so used to routine, we don't realize when it becomes a cage." He hesitated, then lowered his eyes. "I'm not telling you to leave him, Amelia. I just think you should know the truth, so you can decide what you really want from your life." My emotions stormed within me, confusion warring with anger, heartbreak battling denial. "You need to go," I said at last, my voice trembling. A flicker of sadness crossed his features, but he nodded. He walked back toward the foyer, pausing only to glance back at me, as though he wanted to say something more, but whatever words lingered in his mind remained unspoken. He left quietly, the door clicking shut behind him. For a long time I stared at nothing, the house eerily silent except for the rain. Outside, before I realized it, night had fallen. Charles came home, cheerful as usual. He shook off his wet coat and kissed my cheek in greeting. Oblivious to the emotional hurricane inside me, I studied his face carefully, noting the faint lines near his eyes, the streaks of gray at his temples. I remembered the early days of our marriage. His laughter bright enough to fill a room, but now, I couldn't see him the same way I did yesterday that night. As I lay beside him in bed, I found no sleep. The next morning, he left for work as always, pecking my cheek with routine affection. I spent the day drifting through my tasks, painting half-heartedly, picking at a sandwich for lunch. Nothing felt real anymore. Thursday arrived sooner than I'd anticipated. Charles pulled out his golf bag, slung it over his shoulder, and gave me a warm smile. "I'll be back by dinner, darling," he said. In that familiar tone I'd trusted for decades. I wanted to scream, to confront him right then, but fear froze my tongue. Instead, I said quietly, "I'll come with you." His face fell for just a second, an almost imperceptible flicker of panic crossing his features. Then he laughed as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Amelia, golf bores you." "I just want to see the course," I lied, hating how easily I played along. He hesitated, then nodded curtly. On the drive, neither of us spoke. The tension in the car was suffocating. He turned off the main road onto a winding lane that snaked through dense trees. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might bruise my ribs. Finally, we pulled up to a small cottage, old and quaint, ivy crawling up the stone walls. He cut the engine, exhaling shakily. "Amelia, you can't lie to me anymore," I said. Hoarsely, he stared at the steering wheel, then slowly looked up. His eyes filled with a sorrow I hadn't seen in years. "I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake that turned into something I couldn't stop." My chest tightened painfully. "Who is she?" He swallowed. "Her name is Lucinda. Is someone I met through a friend last year. We started talking, and I don't know how it got to this point." "Do you love her?" The words felt foreign, like I was speaking someone else's lines. He closed his eyes, tears beating at the corners. "I don't know. It just became a refuge for me, a place where I felt needed." I let out a shaky breath, tears slipping freely down my cheeks. "What about me? Did you think I wouldn't need you? Or maybe you didn't need me at all?" He reached for my hand, but I jerked away. "Amelia, please," he begged softly. "I care about you, I do. But somewhere along the way we lost each other. I don't even know how to talk to you anymore without feeling like everything is the same day on repeat." I stared at him, a mixture of anger, pain, and a vague sense of understanding swirling inside me. He was right about the monotony, but that had been our life, built together, a safe routine I thought we both wanted. "Does she know you're married?" I finally asked. He bowed his head. "Yes, I told her I couldn't leave you, not after everything." "But you left me anyway," I said bitterly, tears falling faster now. He said nothing, the silence heavier than any denial. Our conversation ended with me stepping out of the car, telling him not to follow. He obeyed, and I walked down the lane alone, ignoring the damp leaves sticking to my shoes. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away from that little cottage of secrets. Eventually I circled back, tears dried on my cheeks, raw exhaustion hollowing out my chest. Charles was leaning against the car, arms folded, staring at the cottage as though it had betrayed him. He drove us home in silence that evening. I couldn't bear to be in the same space as him, so I found myself on Jonathan's porch, hand trembling as I knocked. He opened the door with a solemn expression, as though expecting me. "Amelia," he said gently, stepping aside so I could enter. I sank onto the couch in his living room, a space as neat and meticulously curated as the man himself. A single lamp cast warm light across bookshelves lined with history and philosophy volumes, and the faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. Jonathan sat across from me, hands folded in his lap, waiting patiently. "He admitted it," I whispered, blinking back fresh tears. "He's been with someone else." He nodded grimly. "I'm sorry." For the first time since I'd known him, Jonathan reached out to place a comforting hand over mine. I didn't pull away. "I just don't know what to do," I confessed, voice breaking. "I've spent my life being Charles's wife. Who am I now?" Jonathan's gaze held steady warmth. "Maybe now you find out." His words repeated in my mind long after I left, like the echo of a faint bell in a still night. For days, Charles and I lived under the same roof, tiptoeing around each other with forced politeness. My emotions swung wildly from rage to sorrow to a hollow numbness. One afternoon, while Charles was at work, I ventured to the old trunk in our attic, Searching for something I couldn't quite name, I found an old scrapbook, filled with pictures of us in our 20s. Beaming smiles, arms wrapped around each other as though nothing could break our bond. Flip through these memories with me. In every photograph, we looked carefree, brimming with hope, yet that hope eventually faded into routine as we pursued careers, mortgages, and the silent acceptance of a life that felt safe. We never realized we were drifting apart, not until it was too late. That night, Charles tried to talk to me again while we sat at the kitchen table, an untouched dinner between us. "Maybe we can fix this," he ventured. Quietly, his eyes were rimmed with shadows, as though he hadn't slept in days. I toyed with my fork, my appetite non-existent. "How can we fix something you've broken?" He closed his eyes, pained. "I never stopped caring about you, Amelia, that I don't know how to make you believe that." "Actions speak louder than words," I replied, voice hollow. He looked down at his hands, silent, unable to refute the truth in my statement. I felt a pang of empathy, remembering all the good years we'd shared, the small kindnesses that had once been a part of everyday life. Each recollection warred with the image of him standing beside another woman at that hidden cottage, a place of deception I'd never known existed. We fell into a strained rhythm, continuing our daily routines without addressing the growing gulf between us. Gradually, a plan formed in my mind. I needed to confront Lucinda, to understand how this started and why it continued. Perhaps it was foolish, but I couldn't move forward without seeing her for myself. Thus, one Thursday, I summoned every ounce of courage I had and drove to the cottage alone. I didn't tell Charles the first was coming, and when I arrived, his car was parked outside. My breath caught in my throat. In that moment, I doubted the sanity of my decision, but I pressed on, stepping out of the car and walking up the short cobblestone path to the door. When I knocked, my heart hammered so loudly I could hardly think. The door opened, revealing a woman with refined features and a gentle smile that quickly gave way to surprise. "Amelia," she said softly, as though my name was a question on her lips. Charles appeared behind her, eyes wide with panic. I felt like I just walked into someone else's life, a bizarre dream from which I couldn't wake up. "I'm sorry," I managed, throat tight. "I needed to see you, both of you, for myself." Charles ran a hand through his hair, anguish etched in every line of his face. "Amelia, let her in," Lucinda said quietly, stepping aside. I entered, fists clenched at my sides, my gaze taking in the cottage interior. Cozy furniture, a vase of fresh flowers, photographs on the mantel. If this was a love nest, it was more domestic than I'd imagined. I didn't know whether to feel betrayed or pity for how ordinary it all looked. "I don't want a scene," Lucinda began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not here to cause one," I replied, swallowing hard. "I just need to know how we got here." Charles sank onto the nearest chair, pressing his temples with his hands. "I never meant for it to go this far," he murmured. Lucinda, to her credit, faced me directly. Her posture was dignified but tinged with regret. "Charles told me from the start that he was married, that he had no intention of leaving you permanently. It was a friendship at first, confiding in each other about the emptiness we felt in our lives. That emptiness turned into comfort, and we got too close." Her words stung, each syllable a needle prick to my heart. "You talk about emptiness, but did either of you try to fix it with the person you were committed to?" A faint tremor coursed through Lucinda, as though she'd asked herself that question many times. No, I didn't," she admitted quietly. "I let him talk about you sometimes, about the routine that weighed on him, and I rationalized that I wasn't hurting anyone as long as he wasn't leaving you. But that was a lie to myself, wasn't it?" "Yes," I whispered, tears threatening to break free. "It was." Charles lifted his gaze to me, eyes bloodshot. "I never stopped caring about you, Amelia. I just felt so powerless, so stuck. I know it's not an excuse, but I was a coward. I couldn't bear looking at them anymore. Two people who had chosen to betray promises while claiming to be victims of their own unhappiness." Without another word, I turned and left the cottage. I got into my car and drove blindly for what felt like hours, my vision blurred by tears. Finally, I pulled over on the shoulder of a deserted back road and let the sobs come in waves. I felt not just grief but an odd sense of liberation, as though I'd just dragged a rotten truth into the light and set it free. Returning home well after dark, I found Charles waiting. He spoke little, respecting the fragile silence that enveloped us, and I made no effort to bridge it. I retreated into the guest bedroom, shutting the door behind me with shaking hands. It struck me how easily a home can become a collection of separate rooms when trust is shattered. The following days were consumed by an emotional paralysis, a haze of confusion. I spent hours in my sunlit studio trying to paint, but everything I put on. The canvas reflected the storm inside me. Dark swirls and jagged lines that made little sense. I avoided Jonathan at first, embarrassed to face him now that everything was out in the open. But one afternoon, unable to bear my thoughts, I ventured next door. He opened the door, relief crossing his face when he saw me. I said nothing, stepping inside wordlessly, and he simply offered me a seat and a cup of tea. It was quiet companionship, perhaps the only thing I truly needed in that moment. "Amelia," he said gently after I'd sipped half my tea in silence. "What are you going to do?" I set the cup down, staring at my reflection in the dark liquid. "I don't know that I've thought about leaving him, about trying to fight for him, about ignoring it altogether. But none of those options feel right." Jonathan folded his hands. "Forgiveness can be powerful, but only if it serves your heart, not just your habits." I sighed, exhaustion in every breath. "I'm just so angry. All these years I've been faithful, I've tried to keep our home warm and loving, but apparently that wasn't enough." His eyes shone with empathy. "Sometimes people chase illusions of fulfillment instead of communicating their dissatisfaction. I've seen it happen, and it's always painful." I blinked back, tears yet again. "I appreciate you telling me the truth, but it hurts so much." Jonathan looked down. "I wish I could have spared you the pain, but I couldn't watch you stay in the dark." On my way out, he gently squeezed my shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "Over the next few weeks, Charles and I tried couples counseling at my insistence." He agreed. "Desperate to salvage our marriage," he said. I listened to him rehash the same explanations, the same apologies. He said he still loved me, that he'd ended things with Lucinda once and for all. He offered to call her in front of me to prove it. But I refused to be part of another performance. What about my own heart? Could I still love the man who had betrayed me so thoroughly, or was I just clinging to memories of happier times? Each counseling session brought tears, anger, but little resolution. Some nights I cried until there were no tears left, drifting off into a restless sleep in the guest room, haunted by the echo of a life I no longer recognized. During one session, the counselor asked me pointedly, "Amelia, do you want to save this marriage?" I stared at my hands, words failing me as I realized the question was more complex than it sounded. Was it salvageable? Was it worth the work, the painful rebuilding of trust that might never be fully restored? When we returned home, I locked myself in my studio, ignoring Charles's pleas from the other side of the door. That night, I dreamt of the day we got married. An outdoor wedding under a canopy of oak trees. My parents beaming with pride. Charles's face alight with youthful optimism. Remembered how we promised to face everything together, how love was supposed to conquer all. When I woke, tears soaked my pillow, and a heavy ache lay upon my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Slowly, I began packing a suitcase, methodically, as though in a trance. When Charles came home, he found me folding clothes into the faded red luggage we'd used on our honeymoon all those years ago. His face paled. "Amelia, no." He rushed to my side, tears forming in his eyes. That I held up a hand. "I don't know if this is forever, but I need space to think, to breathe." He sank onto the bed, hands gripping the duvet as though it might anchor him. "Don't do this." My heart broke at the sight of his desperation, but I steeled myself. "You did this," I said quietly, zipping the suitcase with finality. I called a friend who lived a few towns over, a single woman with an extra bedroom who'd always told me I was welcome if I needed a break. She listened without judgment, offering unconditional support. I thanked her profusely and loaded my suitcase into the car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I drove away. The next several weeks were a blur of reflection, sorrow, and slow rebuilding. I'd go for walks in the small town near my friend's home, exploring antique shops, sipping coffee in quiet cafes. I found solace in journaling every morning, pouring out my feelings in words, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. I told my friend about Jonathan, about the guilt I felt for confiding in another man when my marriage was falling apart. She listened, nodding sympathetically, reminding me it wasn't my burden to carry alone. Charles called and texted daily at first, Then every few days when I didn't respond beyond a polite acknowledgement, he told me he missed me, that the house felt empty. I missed parts of our life too, the comfortable routines that once anchored me, but I couldn't ignore the betrayal still festering in my mind during that time. I realized how many of my own desires I'd sacrificed over the years for the sake of maintaining harmony in our marriage. I rediscovered little joys, artistic passions I'd shelved, new interests I'd never explored. When I finally decided to see Charles again to talk, I felt both dread and curiosity. He invited me to meet at a neutral place, a cafe we used to frequent in our early years of marriage. It was a strategic choice, perhaps an attempt at nostalgia. I arrived early, choosing a small table by the window with a view of passers. By hurrying along the sidewalk, Charles arrived shortly after. Shoulders tense, eyes filled with uncertainty, he sat across from me, the silence between us heavy enough to bruise. "How are you?" he began, voice trembling slightly. "Managing," I replied curtly. He fiddled with a napkin, hesitating before speaking again. "I've ended it with Lucinda. The cottage was hers, and I told her I couldn't keep living a double life." She agreed. She even apologized for her role in all this mess. I sipped my coffee, bitterness on my tongue mirroring the emotional tang of the situation. "And what about us?" He swallowed, gaze searching my face. "I still love you, Amelia. I know I messed up, but I want to make it right. If you'll let me. If you need more time, I understand." I set the cup down, exhaling slowly. "Love alone won't fix this, Charles. I need trust, honesty, and respect. Those things are broken, and I don't know if they can be mended." His eyes shone with tears. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes." A strange mixture of relief and resentment coursed through me. I wanted to believe him, to find the spark we once had, but fear of being hurt again loomed large. "I need time," I repeated softly. He nodded, blinking away tears. We parted ways with a gentle hug, a sad echo of what we once had back at my friend's house. I found Jonathan's number in my phone. My finger hovering over the call button, I realized he was the one person who knew the truth from the start. Yet I felt a pang of guilt even considering reaching out to him again. In the end I texted, "Thank you for telling me what I needed to know, even though it hurt. I hope you're doing well." He replied simply, "Take care of yourself, Amelia. You matter more than you realize." I stared at the words, unexpected warmth flooding my chest. Perhaps in another lifetime, Jonathan might have been someone I could confide in without guilt. But in this tangled situation, it felt inappropriate to rely on him further, especially while I was sorting out my marriage. Some weeks later I decided to return home, if only to see how it felt. Charles was waiting at the door, the house unusually tidy, as though he'd tried to erase any trace of our fractured life. He asked if we could talk, and we sat at the dining table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals and once naive dreams. He produced a handwritten letter, carefully folded, and slid it across to me. In it, he poured out his regrets, acknowledging how he'd taken our life for granted, how the affair wasn't just about seeking another woman, but about running from the sense of stagnation he'd allowed to creep into our marriage. He wrote that he was ashamed of his weakness, and that he understood if I never forgave him. But he wished I'd remember the better man he once was, and could be again. I read it twice, tears blurring the words. Charles watched me with quiet anticipation, not interrupting, not pushing. When I looked up, I saw vulnerability etched into every line of his face, and something inside me softened. I told him I wasn't sure if we could go back to what we were, but maybe we could find a path forward, different from before, if we worked at it, really worked at it. He nodded, eyes filling with relief and sorrow and love, all colliding in a tumultuous wave that mirrored my own emotions. That night, for the first time in months, we spoke honestly about where we had drifted, about the regrets we both harbored, the unspoken disappointments in ourselves and each other. It wasn't a magical fix, and it hurt to hear how many resentments had been buried over the years, but it was real. Few days later, Jonathan knocked on our door, perhaps sensing that things had shifted. He offered a polite smile, a bag of groceries in his hand. "I was picking up some items and thought you might need a few things." His gesture felt like an olive branch of sorts. He had no intention to further intrude on my marriage. I thanked him, and Charles stood beside me, nodding stiffly. His gratitude toward Jonathan was subdued, tinged with wariness, but he recognized the role Jonathan had played in bringing the truth to light. After Jonathan left, Charles turned to me, an uncertain expression on his face. "I owe him a begrudging thanks, I suppose," he said quietly. "Though it's complicated." I reached for his hand, weaving my fingers through his. Yes, it is. In the weeks that followed, we began the delicate process of rebuilding. We kept up the counseling sessions, each discovering new facets of ourselves that had long been neglected. I started volunteering at a local art center, finding fulfillment in mentoring aspiring painters. Charles cut back his hours at work, recognizing how he'd poured too much of himself into a career that, in the end, couldn't replace genuine human connection. Every day was a test, a chance to choose honesty and openness over resentment or evasion. We stumbled, we argued, we cried. But we also had glimmers of the intimacy that once defined us. On a quiet Sunday morning, Charles set aside the newspaper and asked, "Do you still want to share your mornings with me?" I looked at him, remembering the man I married, the one who once danced with me in the kitchen at sunrise. "Yes," I whispered, feeling a cautious optimism blossom inside me. "We're not the same people we were in our 20s, and our marriage isn't what it was even a year ago. But perhaps that's okay. Maybe growth means letting go of illusions and forging a new bond, grounded in truth rather than unquestioned habit." As I stand now, reflecting on this turbulent journey, I realize that sometimes life unravels to force us to see what we truly need and who we truly are. It's messy, painful, and frightening, but it can also be the catalyst for a rebirth of self and relationship. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Have you ever faced a betrayal that led you to rediscover not just the relationship, but also yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below, because your insights might help someone else find their way through the storm. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of human relationships, and stay tuned for our next tale. Take care and remember, you deserve to be seen, heard, and loved, always.